Welcome to the ISTEP Network podcast. We provide real-world insight into complicated sustainability topics.
Hear from frontline practitioners and experts.
Welcome to ISTEP's podcast, the July edition. I'm Jyoshitha, Sustainability Analyst at Fosterra and Research Analyst for ISTEP, and I will be your host for the next 30 minutes. We are joined by Ben, CEO and founder of Fosterra and ISTEP. So before we begin, Ben, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Jyoshitha. I appreciate it. This is going to be a really interesting topic today, and I'm happy to create the podcast with you. I've been working in the sustainability field for nearly 20 years on topics like this, with a focus on solving challenging problems in the private and public sector. And I worked on projects in over 100 communities worldwide. And so this is a really interesting way to share ideas and best practices. So let's get things started.
Yeah. I'm really excited to discuss today's topic. So, University of Bath hosted Prime Conference this year. For our audience who are not familiar with Prime initiatives and conference focus on transforming business education to support global sustainability and responsible leadership. And this year's theme was responsibly navigating the turbulent business world. And it brought together educators, researchers, practitioners, and policymakers to explore how business schools and organizations can lead with integrity and purpose. And we were invited to be part of the event, and the last day was powered by ISTEP. We hosted two seminars. The first one focused on how to green-proof sustainability communications, and the second one provided examples on how organizations can find and expand the value of sustainability-related activities that's already happening in their organization. We had some great discussions during these sessions, and today we're just pulling back the curtains on those conversations to share what we discussed, the observations we had from attendees, and just how the overall event went. So let's dive into the first seminar topic and begin with the terms greenwashing and green hushing. We have all heard about the term greenwashing. It's been all over the news and it's something we're familiar with. But Ben, for our audience, can you talk a bit more about green hushing and why we found, the topic important today?
Yeah, thanks, Jyoshitha. This is really a hot topic across the board. The companies that we're talking to and that we see in the news, they're increasingly concerned by all the political uncertainty around making green claims. And so both through their formal reporting requirements to government agencies or other organizations that they're reporting through, like CDP, or their end consumers and their key clients, they're really concerned about that because even though they may be making progress on sustainability efforts and setting targets, they're increasingly not talking about the details. And we call that green hushing. Actually, during London Climate Action Week, the same week that we had the Prime conference in Bath, BSI, a large institution, shared their latest research, and it aligns well with this issue. One of the key topics they shared was across the G7 countries, businesses largely will continue to pursue their targets even within the uncertainty in the political environment. But they are finding other ways to talk about it. Their term for this is called climate coding, basically focusing on the related outcomes and benefits from sustainability actions like resilience or cost savings, rather than net zero, for example. And so that's what we call green hushing.
Yeah. I found those findings that BSI shared very interesting when we were at the Responsible Supply Chain Conference. But yeah, before we sidetrack, we discussed a few reasons why companies might greenwash or green hush in our seminar. And among the reasons that we discussed, which ones did you find the most interesting?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of drivers for this. As I mentioned, some is just the broader political uncertainty, but on a more tactical level. And these are some things we discussed with our academic and private sector folks during the seminar, was that there's a concern they don't want to be subject to scrutiny if they miss the targets. Sometimes they say, well, if we're going to set a net zero target or reduce by 50% by a certain year, and then they don't do it, they feel like they're exposed to that risk. And so that's something that they're concerned about reputationally. Another challenge they have is that they often don't have the resources to really fully elaborate on the talking points and be able to balance those. There are certain regulations about how to communicate green claims. And so if you craft those claims well, you can stay within the lines. But if you don't have the expertise internally, you might not be able to do that effectively. So they may choose to do nothing again instead of
Mhm.
exposure. And then for a lot of reasons, there can be political pushback if you make certain claims, especially in ESG targets or in the investor community. If you make those, and then maybe there's a political backlash that could happen. So there's also concern there, just not that there's any concern about whether they're going to hit it, but just the perception of that. So unfortunately, those are some things that we covered that can really encourage people to hold back on sharing.
Yeah, yeah. I remember when we were discussing why companies might green hush, especially. Like I think the audience mostly felt that, or even before like jumping into the topic, what I thought was that, under we're not sharing enough could not be that big of an issue, but it clearly is. Like how overclaiming is greenwashing and how that is an issue. Underclaiming is also an issue. And obviously, we discussed the issues that's associated with green hushing when taken too far. What were the some issues that, again, you found were so interesting that why companies should not green hush?
Yeah, what are some of the implications of that? And I think you mentioned it already, is that when they don't talk about it, you kind of forget that it happens and that it's a gap.
Mhm.
Sometimes gaps are hard to see. But the reality is that there are some major implications by not talking about these things. First off, industry leadership, you do really take a hit to your position as a leader in that industry or the potential to be a leader, showing that you're moving towards the common goal at the end, right? And that's whether it's consumers or retail channels or your primary B2B customers. Employees these days increasingly want to work for a company that has targets that is moving towards those. And when you don't talk about them, they don't hear about them either. I can guarantee you that 90% of the employees in any given company don't know everything that's happening with their sustainability efforts. And so if you don't talk about that, they'll think maybe you're weak on that topic. And so that's an issue. Also, for the sustainability professionals themselves, if you can't effectively share this, then you lose out on some of the value that's being created. And we talked about that in our second seminar a little bit more. And so it weakens the case that you might make because here's things that we could demonstrate the benefit for externally, but we're not doing that. And so that makes it harder maybe to invest in the next one. And then if you step way back in any given sector, if the major companies in that sector aren't talking about the work they're doing to move things forward from a sustainability or environmental perspective, then the whole sector can slow down, right? Because there's peer competition that happens, there's some rivalry, and so it's like, oh well, they're not taking action, so I don't want to take action. So it really has a cooling effect industry wide. So I think
Yeah.
there's a lot of reasons why you wouldn't. I guess, Jyoshitha, from your perspective, do you have any other thoughts on green proofing sustainability communications that we might want to share?
Yeah, yeah. So I think it was interesting when we discussed the extremes, right? Overclaiming and underclaiming, and our solution was green proof your sustainability communications. In the session, I really liked how we pulled the example of Patagonia, where they said nothing we do is sustainable in the sustainability report. So Patagonia is also a company that's known for, actively taking sustainability measures. But despite that, they said that, oh, nothing we do is sustainable because for any company, they can't be so sure because they have no control over a lot of things, and they might not be focusing on everything that's under their control either. So I think when we spoke about green proofing, I think the main thing about it is just finding the middle ground, and being honest and communicate things about that you're working on, that you're planning to work on. Be open about it, but yeah, but also be very, honest about this is what's happening, this is what we're taking action on, so that you don't underclaim, you don't overclaim, you just directly just state what you're doing and what's happening in your
Yeah, I
business.
would say, yeah, that's a great example. And I think in general, companies are really hesitant to share the challenges they face
Mhm.
because, as we mentioned, reputational risk and just something they're not used to doing. Here's something we're striving for, but we don't know how we're going to get there. That's very atypical. in general, so that's a hard thing. But I'll say for those that are listening that one of the key things with it is that there is a whole community around you that wants you to succeed in sustainability. That's one of the great things about working in this field. Like everybody wants it to succeed. Everybody wants a better future, right? It's pretty hard to argue with that, I think. And so there are, whether there's service providers, whether they're solution providers in terms of technology, or the suppliers that you have for products or services in your supply chain or downstream, like people want to help. So if you say, here's the challenges we have, solutions will come. If you don't talk about that, the people with the solutions don't know that you're in need, and so
Mm.
you're not exposed. So there's a good positive feedback loop, but it's hard to get over that first, opening the door, like you said in the beginning, sort of pulling the curtains back on what the challenges are.
Yeah, yeah. No, I completely agree. Um, but yeah, I think that was a very good summary of our first session. I think now it's time to jump to our second session that we had, which really flipped the lens. It focused on what organizations are already doing, but they often don't realize it, which is why we named it Finding the Hidden Value of Sustainability Actions and any related efforts within an organization. I think I really, really liked how we used the term hidden value. I think it made our attendees really think through, okay, why is this value hidden? So, would you like to share a bit more on that, Ben? Why is the value hidden in this case?
Yeah, and I think the second seminar we had was more of a treasure hunt. We stuck
Yeah.
with the hidden value, and we gave the attendees a little bit of a quiz, or here's some examples, like where might the hidden value be in this, or what do we mean by that? And I think it's important to define like this hidden value concept. And really, what we're saying is that that value that could be created from an existing effort that's happening in a company just to improve operations. Um, there is additional value for sustainability oftentimes that is not maybe easily known or communicated, and because it may not be the primary intended outcome. In other words, they're improving operations, and oh, by the way, that reduces energy use, or there are, building a new facility to the latest codes and standards for insulation, and that's something that will reduce their net impact. Uh, Another thing too is it could be spread across the organization. So there are a lot of different functions, whether it's in HR, whether it's facilities maintenance, whether it's product design, where they're making choices to optimize what they do, and that may have a beneficial impact from a sustainability ESG perspective. And then I think another thing that makes it hidden is they're not really effective at communicating it. So this goes to our first seminar a bit, which is, what are the metrics that it relates to? So how do we measure those sustainability impacts, and then how do we communicate that even just internally, not necessarily externally? So those are a few things that make them hidden, is because it's either hard to find, or there's a connected benefit that seems to be taking the most visibility, or it's just difficult to find a way to describe it when it comes from an area that is not sustainability driven.
Yeah, yeah. I think I want to steal your treasure hunt reference for a minute there. I'm gonna ask you if it is hidden, like where should people look for it then?
Yeah, it's great. I think if you realize that there's probably opportunity there, and I will tell you 100% of every company we work with or entity we work with, there are opportunities to really leverage things that are happening. And then it's exciting because that builds momentum. That shows, hey, we're not starting from zero. We actually have a lot of things that we can do, that we have done over the years to get to where we are today. And so if you want to go on that treasure hunt and you want to look for the hidden value, I mean, one of the easiest things to start with is waste. Waste is a core in whether it's time or effort or materials or energy or anything. Companies are always looking to reduce that, right? Because that's a cost. And there's also typically an efficiency gain as well when you reduce waste, because all the effort that went into creating those last 1,000 units that you had to throw out, well, that was the 1,000 you couldn't sell, right? And so that's a universal thing that any C-level executive will say, yeah, we want to reduce that when we can. But there's a giant sustainability benefit too, right? The energy that went into making that, the materials that went into making that, the landfill aspect of that, the fact that it never made it to market, the intensity metrics that you might use or also take a hit when you have a wasted product. So that's a great place to start, and everybody buys in. And we've had lots of examples where if you start with that lens, then all of a sudden people get to buy in and start to look for other areas. But then beyond that, one good way that I found that always works in almost any situation is looking at the full life cycle. So if you think about your products or services from the beginning of that, from the inception of, from a design perspective, and then how do you find the sources for the components? Let's say if it's a physical product, and then how do you manufacture it, and then how do you distribute it, and how do you get it to the end customer, and then how do they use it? Those are all things that have a sustainability or environmental impact broadly, right? And so if you think through those and look at like where are we doing things that in the last maybe 1 to 5 years to have improved that, there are going to be things in there that you can
Mm.
find that have already happened or maybe are right on the edge of happening, and you can support those.
Yeah, yeah. I think from there we moved on to the conclusion of our session in University of Bath. And but I really liked how we ended our session. You spoke about how there are two kinds of projects in every organization. There are hero projects and institutional projects, and why both are important. But for our audience here today, can you tell us about how both are actually crucial to keep the momentum going?
Yeah, this was a great closeout for the session or
Mhm.
the second seminar we had. And this is a terminology we use when we're working on projects. So we call them hero projects or institutional. And a hero, as you can imagine, that's something that's visible and tangible, and it shows what's possible, right? This is something that is easy to describe and people can rally around. They're usually not large scale, meaning they're recognizable and can be communicated. But if you think about a demonstration project, like here's a new technology we're going to try, or a community engagement activity, these are things that people can immediately relate to and they can see and you can communicate, but they might not have the largest impact. They typically don't, but they're easily relatable. On the other hand, are institutional projects. In other words, these go deep into the organization, into the institution, and make a much larger impact. But they tend to take more time and investment. So it's not something you just demonstrate immediately. And they're often not really like sexy projects, we might say, that have that high communication value. If you think about, for instance, replacing natural gas burners with an electric technology that's embedded in some process, that might be really hard to get excited about, except for those sustainability nerds like us, but ultimately it's going to have an impact. So, but they're both important because you need the heroes to be able to talk about we can get things done, we can
Mhm.
demonstrate, but you have to use that as the springboard to get more institutional projects done. And then that also creates more momentum and maybe some funding support as well.
Mhm.
So it was super interesting to talk through that and get the audience also thinking about what this could mean and take back from that. So I guess when we wrapped it up, Jyoshitha, we got some good feedback. What do you think the audience felt about about these two approaches, whether it's on the hero and institutional or just overall on our two seminars?
I think especially with these two approaches, I think they really liked how, we classified them this way. Because it's not, I don't know if it's very often to classify projects as, oh, hero projects and institutional projects. Obviously, one gives more exposure, but one drives real change. But we also briefly discussed about how the hero projects, one, they're visible, but they also help in driving that mindset change within the organization, leading to change, organizational change, which I think the audience found really, insightful because for sustainability professionals to succeed, you just need the support of everyone coming together. And, this helps them realize why it's important or like just get a bigger picture of sustainability. But when it comes to the overall event, I think they really, really enjoyed it because the audience was mostly researchers, I mean, PhD scholars and like even professors. And from what from the interactions I had with them, they said that it was very insightful and a bit refreshing even because we presented a very business lens of these issues. These are like very small things that we like it might be taught in classrooms or like there might be papers written about it, but we really presented what's happening in the organization point of view. And it was really interesting to talk to them about it and like also find out that it was really insightful for them. I think even a couple of them said that it was one of the most interesting sessions they had throughout the conference. So yeah, it was like a really good pat on the back.
Yeah. Yeah, I really appreciated that feedback from them too, that they really got a lot out of it and felt it was useful. And because we had some folks that also represented private sector, they could see the carryover, and that also made it a
Mhm.
great conversation. So we love having those in-person events when we can, of course. That's great to
Yeah.
do. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that was very special. It was ISTEP's first offline event,
Mhm.
and it was certainly a very memorable one.
Yeah. Great. And then your
But
alma
yeah,
mater, right? Where you
yeah,
finished your master's degree. So it's also fun that
yeah,
you get to
that's
bring it
true.
back home, sort of. Yeah.
But yeah, thank you, Ben. It's been a wonderful opportunity for me to co-host the session with you at Bath and also now share the highlights of that session with our audience and listeners today. We're also very, like I said, it's also was a very, very special opportunity for iStep in general. We took a one big step and hosted our first offline session. It was all very great discussions, and what it made me realize was that, oftentimes it's viewed that academia and businesses approach sustainability in very differently. But enabling this dialogue helped us weave those concepts together and, picture what reality looks like. And yeah, each group bought something that the other didn't really realize. And I think that's one of the things that I found very interesting and also beautiful because you get to see others' perspectives and you also see how it all comes together eventually. But yeah, also during the same week, we were part of the Responsible Supply Chain Conference, which was an official event of the London Climate Action Week 2026. And for our listeners, we also have a podcast reviewing that event, so be sure to check that out. And as always, please visit our free iStep resource library to get any updates on hot topics related to sustainability. But yeah, thank you, Ben, and thank you for our listeners.
Great. Thanks, Jyoshitha. Good podcast. Thanks, everyone.